I'm chairing pro tem tonight. Why don't we start with roll call? Forcell here.
Johnston here.
Do we have any comments from the community besides on 3?
See, I don't believe so. I don't believe we have any oral communications not related to an agenda item.
Great. So we'll turn to the minutes.
I move approval unless somebody's got a comment.
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, the minutes have been approved. Any changes to the agenda?
None from staff.
Okay, great. And any reports from any commissioners?
Yeah, I'd like to comment on something. We haven't met since the recent election, and rumor has it that the gentleman on my right got reelected. And I would hope he would use his influence with the council to continue his assignment to be on the UAC. That's the extent of my
Thank you very much
non-report.
for your kind words.
Anybody else? Great. Ed?
All right, very good. Thank you, Commission. Have a few items of note just to review, actually, some activities over the past month. Let's see, first, on November 19th, the council did review and discuss the advanced metering infrastructure and electric supply planning topic. So on November 19th, after a relatively short discussion, the council approved the Finance Committee's recommendation to accept our Utility Smart Grid Assessment and Utilities Technology Implementation Plan. This provided confirmation to staff on our tentative roadmap for AMI, or Advanced Metering Infrastructure. In our rollout, we'll now move forward in coordinating timelines with other major software projects currently in progress, such as our utility customer information system replacement, also known as the billing system. Also on December 3rd, Council approved our Electric Integrated Resource Plan as recommended by the Finance Committee and the Utility Advisory Commission. Let's see, one special event just to note for the Commission. VMware held an event on November 1st where they made a public announcement joint with the city about potentially developing a microgrid at VMware's headquarters in the Stanford Research Park. Campus-like microgrid would serve as a charging site for our own city emergency command vehicles during emergencies, as well as general extended power outages. Commissioners are aware microgrid is made up of both generation, battery storage, and electric loads that can disconnect from the main power grid or power critical electric loads when off grid. This community microgrid could operate cooperatively with our own utility infrastructure to provide a level of backup, and will serve as a test bed for both the company as well as the city for exploring potential for microgrids to advance our resiliency efforts, both at the company and community level. Mayor Niss joined VMware's CEO, Pat Gelsinger, and Congresswoman Anna Eshoo at this event, announcing the public-private partnership. I also appreciate Commissioner Schwartz, Siegel, and Vice Mayor Filseth for being in attendance. And one upcoming event that this coming Saturday, December 8th, Utilities will host a free landscape workshop focused on maintaining native plant gardens and as well as leak detection. So feel free to join us, any members of the community, including the Commission, at Mitchell Park Community Center for this event on Saturday between 9 a.m. and noon. Detail and registration are available at the city's website, cityofpaloalto.org/workshops. That concludes my report.
Great, thank you. So I think we'll turn to item 1, the staff recommendation that the UAC recommend that the City Council approve the continuation of the 2018 Utilities Legislative Guide into 2018.
Good evening, Commissioners. Heather Dollar, Senior Resource Planner. I think it's been about a year since I last came before you to do much the same thing, to talk a little bit about what has happened, what we think is going to happen legislatively, and just briefly talk about the guidelines for your review for next year. Maybe not. Oh. Or not. Okay. Oh, there you go. Okay. With your permission, I'd like to take it a little bit out of order this year. Usually we talk about what has happened, and then we talk about what we think is going to happen. I'd like to reverse that for two reasons. One is that the legislature has already had their check-in session, but they've already started introducing bills, a few/many bills. And so candidly, mentally, we're already in 2019. Additionally, I'm cognizant of the fact that you received in your quarterly report today a summary of key bills as well as their final disposition. You also received an informational report in October, just a few months ago, a summary of those key bills and their final disposition. And you also received a report in August about those bills. So since there's been 3 bites at that apple, I thought I'd not belabor it, and we can talk a little bit about that after we maybe get into 2019, if that works. Okay, so here's some things that we think are going to happen and going to come back in 2019. Regionalization, which if you recall is the joining of the California grid with Western States grid, that failed last year. That was the 3rd time, I believe, that such a bill has failed. Last year, that bill was mostly with regard to the governance structure of what a regional body would look like and had a lot of CAISO involvement. When it failed, we heard from the Senate Pro Tem, Senator Atkins, that it would return again in 2019, but we don't know at all what that bill will look like in 2019. We've heard rumors that CAISO doesn't want to deal with it anymore. We heard that they are just over and done with the regionalization effort. Tomorrow, we could hear something different. But as of right now, we know there's going to be some bill. We think CAISO's not going to be involved, and we don't know what that's going to look like. But we will certainly be tracking it. With regard to wildfires, unfortunately, due to the recent wildfires, or I should say the wildfires that seem to never end, we do anticipate that there will be just as much legislation in 2019 as there has been in 2018. We have seen press reports that our own Senator Hill wants to break up the IOUs and wants to just get rid of the investor-owned model. If he indeed does introduce legislation, that will be a really heavy lift, as you can imagine. That legislation has not yet been introduced, but he certainly has time. So we're waiting to see what might happen if indeed anything does happen like that. We do know that Assemblyman Holden has or will introduce a bill that is going to expand upon another bill that is going to allow for rate recovery for the investor-owned utilities. Also, inverse condemnation and strict liability, which is the legal concept of a utility being responsible even if it is not negligent, was an issue that was brought up at the end of last session, pushed primarily by Governor Brown. That might come up again this session. If it does, that will be huge because tort lawyers will be all over it. So that will be something we'll look into. And that's not even to speak of some of the other smaller bills that might come about as a result of the recent campfires. So that's going to be a big issue.
So Heather, would
Yeah.
you prefer we ask you questions as each bill
Oh,
gets discussed?
Commissioner, please go ahead. Now.
Well, I'm just trying to figure out what Senator Hill might think would be an alternative to PG&E. If we eliminate, is the state going to take over the electrical and gas
In a
utility?
sense, he stated that he loves public power. He's a big fan, which is great. So he has thoughts about trying to contort them into a public power type of model is something that he has said publicly. He doesn't, that I have heard, have any designs of the state taking it over, no.
Yeah, well, if anything's going to happen, we're going to need an alternative to PG&E and SCE and Southern Cal Gas and the others.
Yes, you're right. I should also note that 2019 is the beginning of a 2-year session, which could be good, could be bad, depending on how you look at it. That means that any bills that gets introduced in 2019, if they don't pass, that's okay, because they can continue on to 2020, which means I could be sitting here next year having the same conversation about bills that were introduced that haven't passed, that we're still going to have to concern ourselves with in 2020. With regard to procurement mandates, we saw last year some bills that failed, luckily, that would have demanded source-specific procurement. In other words, they would have said that electric utilities, including POUs, had to procure certain megawatts of certain sources of renewables, such as geothermal and such as biomass. We hear that bills like that might come again, so we're going to keep our eye on that. Separately, but in the procurement bucket, is a notion of a centralized procurement state entity. A bill was just introduced Monday or Tuesday that would require the CEC and the CPUC to report back to the legislature in 2020 a joint assessment of options for establishing a central statewide entity to procure electricity for all end-use retail customers in the state. Additionally, SDG&E has stated that they want to get out of the commodity business. And they, through Senator Huiso, have a draft legislation, it's not an actual bill yet, that would call for a state energy procurement task force, in addition to calling for the state to help relieve them of their contracts to buy and sell electricity. So that state procurement model is something new, and it's something we're definitely going to be keeping our eye on. With regard to energy storage, there were bills last year that would have us develop a rebate program for energy storage. It died very early on, but we think that might come back again. Large hydro, there were 2 bills that came up early and unfortunately died early that would have large hydro count toward the RPS, which, as you know, large hydro is not considered renewable in California. However, now we have SB 100. So large hydro might be a conversation that policymakers are willing to have again this year, whether or not it can be applicable into the RPS. Some of the things that aren't on this slide that we think might also come back is electrification of buildings and transportation, and perhaps the small cell issue. If you recall, small cells is the wireless infrastructure that communication companies want to place on citywide poles, including utility poles for 5G. There was a bill last year that was vetoed. We think it will come back, however, we don't know if it's going to be in 2019, but we're certainly going to be keeping our eyes on that. Lastly, with regard to next year, a big unknown is the new governor. Governor Brown was interested in regionalization, and as I mentioned, he was interested in wildfire tort reform as it regards to strict liability. We don't know about Governor Newsom. Publicly, he has stated that he wants to focus on health care for all, preschool for all, and in fact, there's been some of those bills already introduced, cradle to college education, a new middle-class workforce strategy, an end to childhood poverty, and a plan for aging with dignity. These are big, big policy issues. So how he's going to work all of this in 4 years or more is not yet seen. Whether or not it'll take his attention away from some of our issues, we don't know yet. That's just kind of a big question mark. So unless there's any questions, I can just quickly turn to what we saw in 2018. And because you have already had a few different written reports, I'll just touch on 2 big bills. SB 100, you've heard about in the news, we've reported on it, I won't belabor that. We were doing well with regards to the increased 2030 RPS mandate from 50% to 60%. We're doing fine there. There is also the second prong to that bill, which is the 100% clean energy, zero carbon energy by 2045. Interestingly, there's not been a lot of talk that I've heard of, perhaps you have, with regard to how the state is going to get there. We're going to have to do something regulatorily. I've not heard from any state agencies about what they want to do. Perhaps they're thinking that 2045 is a ways away and they aren't going to want to do anything now. But it'll be interesting to see that large hydro conversation. And then with regard to SB 901, this is a bill that came about from a wildfire conference committee, a joint committee in the legislature that took part in the latter part of this legislative session. SB 901 is a very big bill that came out, focusing mostly on the IOUs. For us, it mandates a wildfire mitigation plan for our electric utility that will go to council in early 2020. It is something we have to prepare and contract with an independent evaluator to assess, and it's something that we will be required to do annually. We have already been working with CMUA on implementing this bill and developing a template. We won't have any problems complying with this bill. One of the things that we're all going to be looking at, though, is whether or not the legislature is going to want to change the requirements contained in this bill now before the reports are even due in 2020. They do that quite a lot, particularly in this space, particularly with regards to things like IRPs, which aren't even due yet, but it doesn't stop them from changing the requirements and moving the needle. So we're going to be paying attention to that as well. Any other 2018 bills, Commissioner Trumbull?
Yeah, the wildfire mitigation kind of surprised me. I know we do have foothills where there's some risks there, but this was such a major bill, I can't imagine we were much of a player in that whole process. But you mentioned the certification. Is there a body of people that even know how to do that?
With regard to the independent evaluators? Yes, CAL FIRE will develop a list for use by the IOUs. The bill does not state that the POUs have to use that. NCPA, as you know, our joint power agency, has contracted with a third-party entity that we believe will assist us in preparing that list of independent evaluators. The bill doesn't list specific attributes that the evaluators have to have, other than they have to have experience in fire safety and electrical utilities. But the entity that NCPA is contracting with has a lot of experience with public power. They used to be members of and work with APPA, the American Public Power Association. So it's a little nebulous, but we think that we're going to be able to meet the spirit and the letter of the law in that respect.
Thanks.
Do you have any questions? One other question on that. Do you have any sense of how much added budget we're going to need for that? Or is it pretty much subsumed in our annual care and maintenance?
We haven't talked about budget yet, and we haven't sat down with NCPA to talk about the contract or the subcontract just yet.
No, just, I mean, we have already been taking additional measures on fire mitigation. We went to council with some recommendations back in, when was that? August. So there is already a lot of mitigation in our budget. I think what we're going to have to do through this process is look to see whether we expand it, and there could potentially be some budget impact.
Question about 2019 and the areas you touched on. Are there any of them that worry you, that you're watching the bills because there would be pretty adverse consequences to CPAU should they pass?
Not yet. The legislature is only kind of in session, and so there's only been a couple of bills introduced yet that I've scanned. None are particularly concerning, to your point. Yes, in fact, there's a couple that are what we call spot bills, placeholder bills. They just say the legislature intends to do X, Y, and Z just so that they can hold their spot. So as of today, I would say no. The deadline to introduce bills is February 22nd. So in early to mid-March, we will have a much better sense. That's when all the bills come flying in after they've met that deadline, and those spot bills I just mentioned start dropping off. So I certainly have a better understanding, and we'll have much more information for you in your quarterly report that meshes with that March deadline. And then lastly, just a little bit brief talk about the guidelines. The guidelines that you all approved last year have worked very, very well. In fact, I have on this slide this nice Latin phrase, which essentially means if it isn't broke, don't fix it. The current guidelines have allowed us to work with outside entities well. We've been able to advocate for the utility lines. They have helped us seek guidance in grant funding such as Prop 98, which can hopefully help us with some water and watershed projects. So we are not seeking any changes and would ask that we continue these same guidelines contained in your packet into 2019. And if there's no discussion, I believe the next, or the action is to take up the motion. I'm happy to answer any questions.
We are going to have to handle the hordes of people that want to speak on this item.
I move we recommend that.
I'm serious.
What?
Anybody who wishes to speak on this item? Okay, we can move onward.
So then I go ahead and move that the UAC recommend that the City Council approve the continuation of the 2018 Utilities Legislative Policy Guidelines into 2019.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
The motion
Thank you.
carries. Thank you, Heather. We'll move on to number 2, discussion about the resiliency workshop.
Well, they got 2.5 months.
Commissioners, I am Debbie Lloyd, Utilities Compliance Manager, currently acting Assistant Director for the Engineering Division. We were supposed to come in October with this update and next steps for the resilience workshop. That meeting got a little late, so we didn't manage to get in front of you. But here today, and the goal today is to do a brief summary of the August workshop. That was the initial workshop. I think back in October, our direction was that we didn't need to do much of a summary. I don't know if 2-3 months later you would like to discuss it more. But our real goal here was to take a look at the draft vision and goals that came out of that workshop and then talk about the next steps. So when we went down this path, our idea was this would be a double workshop with kind of a first one to be more foundational, to kind of get a feel for the direction and priorities from the commission and from the community, and then move on to a second workshop that would be a lot more focused on coming up with some actionable items. From the August 28 workshop summary, we had some pretty common themes. I was actually surprised, given the number of people that did seem to be kind of honing in on some common themes and priorities from the community. First came up was developing a roadmap for the smart grid, smart utility. I think that's something that everyone is aware of and would like to see moving forward. How we manage our critical facilities, providing community support, and kind of highlighting or identifying some key locations in the community that would be the hub for people during some disaster. Developing some kind of technical utility volunteer group that might be helping down with shutdowns, and then also about communication. So what do we do after the utility outages occur? So when things come up, kind of one of the basic ones is what do you turn on first? So in the report, in the appendix or attachment B, we had a preliminary initial resilience vision and goals. This is a straw man. It's totally to be discussed, taken apart, put together. But in that, the draft vision was that our role as the utility in supporting community resilience was by advancing our utilities to become smart utilities. able to assist the city to prepare, respond, support, and rebound from man-made and natural disasters. In the goals, again, they are written out fully in the attachment, but just up here on our presentation, I've just got the main kind of headlines. So 3 major goals. One was to assist the city in ensuring that residents can stay in place. So that was kind of a resounding theme that we heard, that people wanted to be able to stay in place during emergencies or return pretty quickly. So what can we do to assist in that occurring? Again, I don't want to just read through what you have in the report, but this concept of having hubs, community hubs, where that could provide assistance and access to power and water, education, communication, working with the community with emergency response training. Then there was supporting community resilience by prioritizing the utility services and infrastructure support. So again, some key issues, evaluate and establish adequate water and power and water supplies. I mean, what does that mean after a week, after 24 hours? And then prioritization on improvements and updates to our services. And then the third area was actually in enhancing our own utilities to ensure their overall resilience. So, our own infrastructure, what can we do there to have a resilient, hardened system that can recover quickly? What do we need to do in terms of relocations, replacements, upgrades, and building partnerships again with the community? So that was our draft guidelines and goals. So the next steps, we would like to get the second workshop going. I think originally we had envisaged that this would be done by the end of this year. I don't think we're going to pull this together by the end of this month, but when we can get going. There are a lot of community members that have been very engaged in this process, so they're waiting to hear when we can have the next round. Our ideas, our goals for this workshop too, is to really kind of refine this framework and guiding principles. So I think a bit like I said, this was a foundational, so a bit like our legislative guidelines. It's having a clear understanding about what are these guidelines. So when we start looking at the details, at actionable items, how do we have a good set of guidelines to get us on the right path or keep us on the right track. We want it to be more solution-orientated. We deliberately did not want the first workshop to be solution-orientated because we know that everybody has fantastic ideas, very specific things we can do, but we didn't think that would be the most productive way to get the overall feel of where the community wanted to go. And then one of the other things we'd like to hear from you as well is ideas on whether there should be another special workshop, whether it should be part of a regular UAC meeting. We've already heard some opinion that this might not be, council chambers might not be the best location to have the workshop. It's not really set up for an interactive workshop, so maybe we find another site for it, same place we were last time. And then I'll go as well. I guess I should have updated this one slide. Back in October, we were thinking we would get going with the second workshop before the end of the year and then be returning to you in the first quarter of 2019. We may have to bump that out a few months now. And that's the presentation, so.
If I might, also wanted to share with the commission that Commissioner Schwartz also had some input. She couldn't make it this evening, and out of Brown Act limitations, we didn't want to forward her comments to everyone. We did have an opportunity to chat briefly with her. She does have some suggestions for how a second workshop could be structured, and we'd be happy to work with her offline on that. One additional particular goal or suggestion she had for the second workshop is to focus it on, I think the term she used was to focusing on investing in the proactive measures for the kinds of challenges that are reasonably foreseeable. So really drilling it down to the point, both for the utility as well as for the for individual customers, to ideally come out of a workshop with a set of priority investments that, again, would be based on reasonably foreseeable risks. And I think that our first workshop set that up in large measure, and we could provide some additional information that might be helpful to really target that as a key takeaway of a second workshop, if that's of interest to the Commission.
Any comments?
I don't have any.
Well, I was very sorry. I missed the workshop, the first workshop, and I was very sorry to have missed it. I think that it looks like it was a really good start on a discussion, but I agree with the comments that we just heard from Judith about coming up with specific priorities and projects that we can, start to move on, because it's all well and good to have these discussions, but unless we actually start doing something to improve our resilience, we haven't done very much. So I second the idea that the next workshop should be trying to come up with a list of priority projects.
Let's see, a few thoughts. I think one possible perfectly reasonable outcome, if we're solution-oriented, is to identify investments. On the other hand, I don't think it's a bad outcome if we identify, organizational things that need to happen, community groups forming. Like I'm not convinced that the solution has to solely lie in infrastructure investments. A couple of other thoughts. So let's see, I'm just finding the page. The initial resilience vision and goals, I just want to give positive feedback on that. And I feel like that largely captures what I heard, or a response to what I heard in the workshop. On the other hand, the common themes and the draft vision, I just wanted to call out, and I checked it also in the report, the sort of written summary of all the breakout groups. I didn't hear people talking about smart grid, smart utility, and that features prominently in the common themes and in the draft vision. I'm just kind of curious, where's that coming from? Because everything I remember and read in pages, well, basically most of memo number 2, in terms of what does resilience mean, and the people in community group, working group, and the critical services, built environment, economy, smart grid, and smart utility, I don't see listed in there. And what I was taking away from the group was a lot more about, as you were saying, the ability to stay in place, the ability to form community groups, the ability to sort of get critical services, water and power, where they're needed, the need to educate the community about sort of do's and don'ts and what you can turn on and turn off and use and so forth. So yeah, I just wanted to indicate I'm not sure smart utility is entirely, I didn't hear it coming out as a theme, and I don't see it written that other people heard that coming out as a theme. And lastly, in terms of feedback on special workshop or regular UAC meeting, I do think if we want to hear from the community, a workshop format allows for a lot more give and take. And I'll repeat the feedback that I gave after last time, to have fewer outside consultants with PowerPoint decks talking to the group, but rather to give the community much more of a chance to speak. And even if they're wandering off topic, there's usually something that's a nugget that actually is on topic, and we just need to sort of power through that and hear what's on everybody's mind. So I would be very open to another workshop.
I would second what Lisa just said, both in terms of the style being more of a workshop format and less outside input. I think ultimately what I heard from the last workshop was that the community understands and is willing to participate in whatever, in support in case of an emergency, but there's no discussion of what that looks like on an actual community or individual basis. And if we're going to be turning to the community for that support, then we should have a better understanding of how much they're willing to do, how much they're willing to put in ahead of time to learn what to do, and also how to get feedback from even more than those who attend the workshop.
And I guess just one other small thing, hopefully things like their, vision and goals would be posted online in the same place as the invitation or the notice of the meeting, so that hopefully, if it's on the order of a page, we can hopefully expect that people who come to the workshop have had a chance to digest a little bit of information and have that teed up for a good conversation.
So one more thought on that is also, as part of the workshop, I think it would be interesting to hear from the community how they inform themselves and what their recommendations are to inform community members who are maybe less active and don't participate in those workshops, because that has to happen before all the systems are down. Okay, thank you.
Yes, well, I guess the other one would be timing. We got the holidays, so probably looking out till February or March to try and get a workshop together. Hearing the hear about not having the outside speakers coming in with just a deck, but are you looking to have some experts coming in to be part of the discussion? That would just be part of us, what we have to try and pull together in terms of finding time from other people to come in, again, to be more of the discussion rather than standing up and giving a presentation.
Well, I'll give my 2 cents. I'm generally impressed with the depth of knowledge of staff, both of utility and if I recall at the last workshop, there were people from Public Works and Emergency Services to be on hand. A lot of times the conversation takes the form of, we don't know the answer to this question, how does this actually work now? And so having the right people from the city there to answer those questions so we don't get hung up on not knowing the state of the present would be very helpful.
Okay.
And if they had a tiny deck, like 5 minutes instead of 20 or half an hour,
Okay.
maybe.
We do have a member of the public wishing to speak to this subject.
Okay, come on up.
Come on up.
Good evening, commissioners and members of the public. I'm Esther Nihenda. I'm an community emergency response team member and member of Safe Palo Alto's groundwater, speaking for myself. So I'm going to refer to a couple of comments on the memo and a request for the commission. One of the key areas of focus is to develop and manage a technical utility volunteer group. I think CERTs are ideal to help with this. They are taught to do utility shutoffs for the community, and they also teach the neighbors how to turn off the utilities. So you could form an extra group, or you could engage the CERTs more actively to do this job. And also, we also teach our neighbors how to do this, but I think they will forget because it's once in a lifetime. So the pamphlet from Utilities, Are You Ready, is very helpful, and we give it to the neighbors that we have shown how to turn off their utilities. On another topic, on this same memo, I am concerned with the statements on page 4 and page 9, which say, well water can be pumped indefinitely as long as there is power. And the city can provide 9 million gallons of water per day from ground wells if electricity is available. According to the draft groundwater use assessment report, this one, which is part of the city's, which is on the city's website and is part of the city's work, the Palo Alto sustainable groundwater yield is about 2,500 acre-feet per year, which is about 2.2 million gallons per day. This is what is sustainable. The city can pump 9 million, but sustainably we can only pump 2.2 million gallons, which is approximately 20% of Palo Alto's current daily usage. With regard to my request, in disaster after disaster, vulnerable populations have been disproportionately impacted. Vulnerable populations include, but are not limited to, people who are mobility, visually, or hearing impaired, people with medical needs, children, etc. I respectfully request that this commission consider a plan for providing power during and after a disaster to people who depend on electricity for home dialysis equipment, oxygen, lifts, and other medical equipment. As emergency services volunteers, we encourage people to have backup power, such as batteries and generators. The reality is that many in this population may be too sick, overwhelmed, lack the resources or knowledge to do so, and I think the city needs to have a plan for them. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments?
I hope you'll come to the workshop. Thank you.
We'll move to item 3.
Okay, so you'll hear from me again on our Green Acres update and discussion of governance. And then I have Greg McCann here to answer the engineering questions, or others that you want to jump in on. So we wanted to come with an update on what has happened since we last spoke to you about this in August, and also have a discussion on governance of community request for a fully underground system. So I'll go through just an update on where we are with the Green Acres rebuild, looking at our current design practices and rules and regulations. And as I said, I think that mostly we're hoping to get some feedback on an implementation of a rule that would govern these community requests. We also talk about some cost comparisons between the kind of pad-mounted standard design and subsurface design. So as you might recall, in the Green Acres, this was originally petitioned by residents back in 1972. All original equipment was still in use. At the time, this was categorized as a predominantly local benefit underground, and at the time, property owners would contribute 25% of the undergrounding cost. Today, they would be contributing 50%, I think is our current rules. As you may recall, after our original proposal to put in 9 transformers and I think 5 switch boxes. There was considerable consternation from the community. We had a couple of community meetings, and we came to you in August and were kind of tasked with going back and trying to work with the community to find some compromise. So I know Greg worked particularly hard on coming up with another design to try and give us the capacity and flexibility that we needed, but reduced the number of pad-mounted transformers to 6 and managed to relocate them so they weren't going to be, sitting in someone's or just outside someone's front yard, but they would go into side, along side yards, along fences, and hopefully be more discreet. We met with 3 members of the Green Acres board and talked to them, just kind of led them through this idea of the kind of reduced pad-mounted design. We talked about coming out and putting these transformers, just kind of like putting the boxes out where we were thinking they could be located, just to give people a better idea of that visual impact. And again, offered to meet with them in a community meeting if they had some more general questions. We'd also provided some Q&As. We were trying to go through all the questions and provide answers to the questions that we had received, where we had the answers. The feedback that we received over the past month was, while some recognition of the work that had gone in with the new pad mount proposal, that they only really wanted to talk to us about a complete subsurface rebuild. That brings us to basically where we are today. Just a quick kind of overview again of our current design practices and rules and regulations. Our current standard is for pad-mounted transformers, which is the industry standard. We've based this on kind of industry knowledge and our own operational knowledge on safety and reliability, the purchase and maintenance costs, and the additional capacity and system flexibility that you get, which kind of, it's somewhat linked to our talks about resilience. So this is we're trying to design, our goals are to design systems that are safe, reliable, resilient. Now, Greg, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you gave me a nice explanation of the capacity of a transformer, the nameplate capacity versus how you can actually operate it. And his example was you might have a German sports car that can go at 100 miles an hour, but you probably would only be running at 100 miles an hour on the German Autobahn. You wouldn't be running it like that, going across 17 in wet weather. So when we're designing these systems, then we're designing them to be operated at less than nameplate capacity. And when they're subsurface, it's a much, less operable environment for them to be in, so they'll be, probably run or designed to run at an even lower capacity. Our Rule and Regulation 3 requires that all new equipment in underground areas shall be pad-mounted. There is an exception to this that the director, general manager, or designated person can grant that pad-mounted could be installed where it's not, a subsurface can be installed where it's not practical or feasible to put in a pad mount. Generally, those cases would be where we don't have a right-of-way, or where our right-of-way would interrupt traffic flow, be blocking traffic or pedestrian access. Rule and Regulation 20, and these are all rules and regs that we attached as attachments to the report, specifies that the additional costs of special facilities be allocated to the customer who is requesting them. So this is really a rule, doesn't apply in this situation. It was designed for an individual customer who's asking for some upgrade or some connection and requesting something that goes above and beyond our standards that we have to provide the service. And so in that case, to kind of protect other ratepayers from kind of subsidizing these above standard facilities, they pay for the additional cost. They don't necessarily have to pay for the whole cost, but they will pay for anything additional kind of for the upgrading or the additional services that they are requesting. So where we are with in this situation now is that we don't have rules and regulations to address a situation where we have a community that is requesting something that goes beyond our utility standards. And so we have another number of questions that we would like to get your feedback on. First off, I mean, I guess the fundamental is, should we allow for a situation where community or group of customers, of property owners, in an existing underground district that currently has all their subsurface equipment, to request that any rebuild maintain that subsurface design? If this is allowed, then the next question is, should it be the utility or other ratepayers that are paying for those additional costs, or should it be assigned to those that are requesting it? And how do we determine that? So we have an example or a model that we can work with, which is our current special facilities, and the charge that is assigned to the requesting customer in that case would be the additional cost of the equipment and the upfront additional cost of equipment and installation, and then the long-term ownership costs. Because with this, equipment also comes with ownership cost of maintenance, returns to the city on the asset base, additional losses depending on what the equipment is. Once you've done that, the next question is, how do we collect that cost? Again, with an individual customer requesting the service, they get their engineering estimate, and they actually have to pay before we would start construction. In this case, again, we don't have one customer requesting it, we have a number, and how do we collect something that, I mean, we've heard that the vast majority of Green Acres residents support the underground design, but we don't know if everyone's prepared to pay the cost difference. So what is going to be the procedure for collecting those fees, if that's the way we go? Then, given our utilities directive, I mean, it's not just, I think the question has been whether we have a right to go in and rebuild a system. It's more, we think of it more as an obligation to serve. I mean, we don't think of it, we do have an obligation to serve. We have an obligation to provide safe and reliable service. And even though this system has been in place for 45 years without outages, it is 45 years old, and it's significantly past its expected lifespan. So at some point, it will need to be rebuilt. Our goal in the utility is to build before failure, or to rather replace before failure. We're not one of those utilities, won't mention any names, that waits for things to fail 3 times before it gets replaced. We try and replace before that happens. What sort of timing would be appropriate to kind of put on the community to kind of go through a process to get agreement if they have to raise the money or find the money to pay for this? Keep going. I know there's a lot of stuff here, so if you want to jump in. But so possible amendments that we could make to the rules and regulations. So it's who pays for the incremental costs, and this goes back to the same concept that we have with any customer or developer who comes in, wants something done, that to avoid burdening other ratepayers with the added cost, either burdening them with additional costs, higher rates, or having to divert funds from other projects, that the property owners pay for this additional cost. And if we do, sorry, this is kind of staff's proposal, and that the levy to be charged be based on this current special facilities fee with some differences. We're looking at the difference in equipment. Again, it's not the entire cost of the equipment and installation. It's the difference between what we would have paid doing our standard and the extra cost here. A component for cost of maintenance and losses. We are suggesting that we do not include a replacement cost, which is in our current special facilities charge in this let's see, we normally charge for replacement of the transformer because the understanding or the expectation is the transformer will need to be replaced once during a 30-year lifespan. We understand from the residents of Green Acres that their transformers haven't needed replacing in 45 years. It doesn't seem appropriate to collect the cost of a replacement that might not happen. And also, we don't know where we're going to be in 15 or 20 years. We might not even have the option of doing subsurface in that time, so it doesn't seem appropriate to pre-collect that. And then the cost of actually, if this has to be done through a property owner election, do we also kind of build in the costs of that process? Because that's not, we're talking about $20,000+ to do that. And other suggestions put forward by staff is that the formal mechanism for imposing the levy would be imposition of a real property assessment, a tax, basically. And that's what requires the city to prepare an engineer's report, hold public meetings, and conduct a property owner mail ballot proceeding. So essentially, as we're calling it, a property owner election. And then holding a public hearing where an assessment plan could be approved or rejected. We're recommending that to do this, to start this process, that we have at least 75% of the homeowners formally petition for a property owner election. And then again, we would like to set a time limit for the petition and election to ensure that the rebuild does actually get done in a timely manner before we start having major outages. I'm going to add something else in there. In terms of an assessment, there's a couple of other things to think of. There's that upfront cost, the additional cost of the immediate cost that the utility will see for the additional equipment and installation. So would that be assessed in one payment and then kind of annual ownership payments? Like I said, for our current special facilities fee, it's all collected up front, including the 30-year ownership calculation. And again, this is where hope Greg can jump in and help. We'd been asked to provide some more details. If you actually saw one of the engineering estimates, there are a lot of details on all the elements of construction. What we tried to do here was to break it down into kind of like the major components. We're not looking at the cost of the cable replacement because that's going to be equivalent between either design. So we're looking at our standard versus the below ground submersible equipment. And I know we did have a question about, what's this difference between the transformers with load breakers and the loop feed transformers, and why did we design it like that? So I think if you wanted to.
So the loop feed transformers allow us to essentially daisy chain the loop or the circuit. So there's cables that run into the transformer, and the loop feed transformers have an in and out that allow us to reduce the amount of equipment. In the current configuration for the subsurface, every transformer requires a load break, and a load break's kind of like an electrical outlet where you plug in something, and because the way the transformers for the subsurface are designed, there's no way to daisy chain them. And when we do, for a lot of our commercial, for reliability and for also for some of the ability to adjust and adapt to outages, we can use those transformers to sectionalize certain areas. So the loop feed transformers reduce a piece of equipment, and that's why there's a cost difference.
Oops, and with that, that's the end of the presentation. If you have questions?
So I'm missing the bottom line here. I understand everything, I think, after you skip that part. Is it acceptable to have an underground transformer to the utility staff? So while you're thinking about that, I took pictures of all this and gave it to my energy policy students, and all 35 of them said, hell no, the pad's got to be above the surface. And one of them said a lot nastier words. He's an electrician, and said, this is an OSHA violation and I would never go in there. So I'm trying to figure out initially whether there's any reason. I understand the community's objection, but is this something we're willing to subject our employees to?
I think you might have a lot stronger opinion if we had our operations crews here that actually have to go in and maintain and fix those. There's a reason that we changed to the pad mounted. I understand there's frustration that there's not a nice, neat analysis out there that compares the safety of the two. But the reality is that the utility industry provides vital services, and reliability and safety are paramount. And we don't always wait for a nice set of statistics to take heed of operational field observations about something either requiring more service, not being as reliable, or most importantly, not being the safest environment for our workers. That being said, the OSHA requirements are, they don't say you can't have subsurface. They require the confined space training and operations. So it's recognized that it requires additional safety from it, but it's not, at this point, it's not banned by OSHA. But no, we would like to design it with pad mounts.
And in the cost that you just listed here, it doesn't include whatever incremental addition there would be in costs for handling problems in an underground system?
That is something that we, again, we'd like to talk about. That's why we would like to hear from you. What we've done is kind of as a starting point, taken how we calculate the special facilities fee, and it is an average. We basically just take a multiplication factor. I think there's a table in the report that shows this calculation. So it's kind of an average factor that's used. It comes from our rates group. It's how they kind of set rates. And we do that just to come up with like an average cost of ownership. But it doesn't mean that, it's not specific to the subsurface transformers. And it could be more, it could be less. I mean, we're guessing it would be more if you actually costed out the difference in maintenance costs for a subsurface. But that's our starting point.
So to switch to the election, you mentioned not giving costs out, I would agree with what you were inferring, that an awful lot of people are going to not be interested once they hear the actual cost. Is that, how do we do that and have an election if they don't know the cost?
Well, we've run, and again, I've heard frustration that we don't know what the exact costs are. We were trying to get the ballpark. We were talking about a few hundred, a few thousand, tens of thousands. We've looked at it carefully, and depending on how we apply a special facilities fee, we're looking at the range of maybe 3,500 to 5,000. Again, we're coming up with a new fee here. We might think about putting a cap on it.
Those numbers or the figures would be finalized before the actual
Yes.
election. So there would be a two-step. There's a petition up front
Yes.
that's based on basically confirming interest in proceeding with the process, and the engineer's report is really what locks in the actual costs per property.
Yeah, I like that approach. I mean, just for myself, if I saw these numbers, A, I don't want any surface-mounted pad, and B, if I saw the costs, all of a sudden it's going to look a lot more appealing.
So I've got a couple of questions. When we talked about this back in August, my understanding was that we have a number of districts like this one where not only the utility wires, but the transformers are underground.
Correct.
How many of them are there?
So going back to last time, I know we had 5 coming up. Oh, we've got 5 coming up in this.
As I understand, there are 2 of them.
We've had
6 and 7, which have already been.
We've already gone through this process,
And
that
then-
they've moved from all subsurface to pad mounted.
Okay, so I just want to confirm, they were all subsurface before the renewal, and during the renewal, the transformers and the switches were pad mounted?
Yes.
Okay,
And, well, some might be left subsurface if we did not have the right of way or if there was no feasible, but no, if you go around these neighborhoods, you will see the pad mounted transformers.
okay. And that's the plan for the others that, putting aside Green Acres, one, for the others that are currently entirely underground, the plan would be when they are to be renewed, due for renewal, the switches and transformers would be pad mounted.
Correct.
Okay.
And I think last time we estimated there were around 1,200 residential properties coming up in neighborhoods that will switch from underground to pad mounted during a rebuild.
That's 1,200 total, not just Green Acres.
Correct.
Okay.
What's the time frame for coming up? In the next 10 years, in the next year?
I don't know about that. We've got 5 in our current 5-year infrastructure plan.
So there were 2 charts in the materials that came up with different numbers for the special facilities fee. There's one that's on the one that's in attachment A, and then there's one that's on the 4th page of the materials. And I'm just wanted to understand why the difference in the numbers.
So the difference, so the attachment A was the frequently asked questions that we distributed to Green Acres. And in that case, we had just applied the straight calculation. We have a spreadsheet where we put the cost of the equipment in, and it comes up with a special facilities fee. That included a replacement cost. And then when we started to put together the report, we were discussing about adjustments that we should make to that. The one thing that seemed obvious was that we should take out the replacement cost. So that's the difference.
Okay. So I think those are all the questions I have at this point. I'll have some comments later.
Are you done with your presentation? Okay. We have some speakers who want to come up, starting with, is it Nina Bell? Nina Bell, sorry about that.
Good evening.
Chair and members of the commission, I think you wanted to use a 3-minute timer for the purpose of just marking. So I'll have a phone going and a little chime will go off at 3 minutes.
Okay. Before I start, may I just ask those from Green Acres who are here tonight, would you just raise your hand? Thanks. Good evening. I'm Nina Bell, and I'm scrapping everything I was going to say. I was going to start with the words of the Beatles song, "Help, I Need Somebody," because we in Green Acres, one, need your help to get this sorted out. First of all, you talk about safety, you talk about pad mount versus subsurface. If it's not safe, then why all along Arastradero Charleston are you putting in all subsurface? A question. Second, when I asked Greg McKernan what other district in all of the city was like ours, he could only find one. So I don't understand when you talk about other districts that are coming up, are they fully underground like we are? Or is it just the one, District 25, that Greg found? So there's a definition issue with the word underground, because for the utility department, underground are wires underground and then pad mount. And when in their question and answer, they said District 6 was recently upgraded. I have a friend who lives in District 6 since 1974. They have pad mount from the beginning. They've never had underground. So we are unique. We started entirely underground, and we're not asking to be undergrounded. We already are. And in terms of, the safety of pad mount versus subsurface, just yesterday, one of our neighbors spoke with an explosion and equipment failure investigator, an expert who is here working for the government to investigate the fires and what started the wildfires up north. He's at Stanford University. And what he said was that with a pad mount, if there is an explosion, it creates not only shrapnel, but the insulation oil gets so heated that it flows out and causes a fire. Whereas, yes, there is a fire subsurface, but it is contained within the subsurface. So when you talk about safety, there's many different kinds of safety. And you have safety for the workers who have to deal with it. You have safety for the people who live with this possible explosion with big signs that say, warning. I'm really having a problem here, and I ask for your help here. Because for us, it is an explosion, a problem. Thank you. We don't find it safe.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Jenning Chi.
Hello. Thank you for giving us time to speak here. I'm Jenning Chi. I'm a resident as well as a property owner on Pomona Avenue, same neighborhood. And I was going to speak about the same points that Nina so eloquently already delivers, so I'm not going to repeat. But I was going to respond to the presentation that characterized this installation as a request. I don't agree with that assessment. I think it's more like is maintenance and replacement of what we already have. And that is an underground transformer with underground switches. Everything keep underground. So I think over the years, budgets should have been made to maintain these underground facilities the way they are and replacement in kind. So that is my opinion. So I don't think there should be any additional or special assessment for us to replace them. And as to where there is a differential in installation and maintenance of different systems, I'm sure there are property owners that in different areas with different terrains that will cost more to replace their system than others. And I think all those differences should have been budgeted in the original planning and paid for by the city. So that's my opinion. Thank you for giving me the chance to speak. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Alice Schuyler. Sorry, Sklar.
My name is Alice Sklar, and I'm the president of the Green Acres Homeowners Association. I just want to speak briefly about my impressions of my neighbors' attitudes toward the utilities, and I wish that I could give you facts, but there are none at this point. My board attempted to survey the neighborhood twice, and in both cases, we did not get enough responses to say that the results were significant. I can say, however, that looking at the responses, there were really only 2 in both surveys that indicated the property owner was willing to accept the Palo Alto Utilities Department second design as done. The costs that we quoted in our survey was not substantiated, but it was the number that we had from the Utilities Department at the time. So the vast majority of people, rather than selecting a pad mount or a subsurface option, selected they wanted to have more discussions with the city staff, which seemed very reasonable. When the Palo Alto Utilities Department gives us verifiable costs, including receipts for purchases, copies of contracts, labor payments, et cetera, we can survey the neighbors again for their willingness to pay something to have their utilities placed underground. I informally have spoken to many people, many neighbors. Some email me, and I converse with board members. And as I said earlier, only 2 have indicated that they would be willing to settle for something other than a fully underground system. Because of the overwhelming interest in having the utilities underground, I spoke to Deborah Lloyd and told her that really we were wasting our time dealing with alternatives. Greg did design a very nice alternative, but I think while it's still possible to have fully undergrounded utilities, neighbors are not really going to engage with that as an option. I was hoping for 2 things tonight. One was I was hoping that the Utilities Advisory Committee would give the Palo Alto Utilities Department permission to go ahead and change their rules and regulations so that we can have our neighborhood could be in a district that has room for above-ground pad-mounted transformers, but wants to have underground utilities instead. My other hope for tonight was for the Palo Alto Utilities Department to clarify what the real costs of undergrounding our utilities are, so that we could survey our neighbors with a real figure for them to consider. I just want to say, in addition, that I found the Utilities Department very responsive to me and my board. We've not previously questioned the cost estimates, but we do need to do that now. When we have those figures, we can survey our community again. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Nancy Steinbach?
My name is Nancy Steinbach, and I live on Pomona. And one of the things I'd like to bring up is the rules and regulations, because staff points to that. And my concern is, when was the rules and regulations for a neighborhood like ours, when was that changed? Obviously, 45 years ago, when the boxes were put down, that was not a rule and regulation. So there's been some change, and when that change happened, our neighborhood was never informed. We never knew about it. We never had a chance for a discussion. So I did want to point that out. And what I'd also like to talk about is it really does affect us to put those boxes above. They're huge things. And what I don't understand is why this is being pushed on our neighborhood. Part of our neighborhood borders Arrestadero. We have houses on Arrestadero, and a great deal of work is now being done on Arrestadero, and so the boxes that are below, they're staying below. And new boxes are actually going below. At the Bowman school site, they have an annex that they're building, and they have plenty of room for putting boxes, but they're going underground. And don't get me wrong, I'm glad they're going underground, but I'm baffled to the issues of safety when this is happening right on the street, bordering our neighborhood. So, and also along the Charleston corridor, they're pulling the wiring and the transformers, and they're putting them down. So I really feel strongly that we shouldn't have to pay for it. All the surpluses that utilities has had over many, many years should be enough to cover for the upgrades. So I want to thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Debbie Chauso?
Thank you. Okay. I'm going to, for time's sake, just take up where you guys left off in August, at the August meeting, which was you decided you weighed employee risk, okay, maintenance employee risk, against what you thought was our priority concern, which was aesthetics and even property values. And, oh, thank you. And yeah, I understand that you decided that it wasn't worth the risk of one life. Since then, well, I'm going to talk on two things, safety and cost. I realized that you have installed, upgraded, and plan to install new underground transformers in all commercial districts. And I believe the high-impact housing, the developments that are being built everywhere, like along, well, I don't know if it's along El Camino, I mean, there are not setbacks there that can accommodate pad mounts. So when you think about the number of underground transformers that those districts, current and planned, will require are 6 to 8, I can't understand how they add appreciably to employee risk. Am I being clear? Okay, the numbers, I think they'd be in the hundreds. Okay, that's my guess. So we have 6 to 8. Then I realized that safety-wise, if you take anyone, and we do not feel cavalier or we don't want to sound like we disregard employee safety. It's very important. I mean, it's obviously important. But if you look at I'm a biostatistician, if you look at their hours of exposure, okay, in our neighborhood, maintaining, doing the checks that you said you believe you did once every 3 years, you're talking about a couple of hours of an employee exposure, whereas there are exploding pad mounts. And our neighborhood live with that risk 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, a year, all year round, okay? The underground transformers have grills built into the street precisely to relieve pressure so that if a transformer explodes, it doesn't erupt through the earth and hurt people. The pressure goes out, those grids, okay? They're all over the streets. I then want to say that, what was I going to say? Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, as far as the cost, it occurred to me that because you have purchased these presumably upgraded, state of the science transformers, and that's what's being put in the commercial districts, okay, you have precise cost information of a transformer, and that they've been put in. You have the labor costs too, and I'm the person who did the analysis of the 5 documents we received in September and tried tracking the costs and to their sources. I realized we would just like the actual bills. We want to see an invoice for a transformer, then we'll understand the cost times 8 and the bills for the labor that you spent. And it just dawned on me today, but I feel like we're not asking for unreasonable paperwork. We've wanted it for 8 months and haven't gotten it, and now I'm certain that it exists, okay? The last thing is Mr. Shikata's estimate of $20,000 for extra department, resources to evaluate a petition that we'll do in our neighborhood once we have the cost information. I have to think about 8 months of Mr. Shikata's time, other utility personnel's time. The meetings alone have been between here and with our neighborhood and at Coverly, that's 10 hours of everybody's time, okay? The communications, the letter writing, the memorandum, it's way over $20,000 fighting us. And we just want the precise cost, and we don't want to survey our neighbors until we have that. It's ridiculous to ask them to make a decision when they don't know what they're deciding on, okay? Some of us have even talked about, maybe doing a sliding scale. That's an intra-neighborhood discussion, okay? But we really believe people want it. We don't know that everyone can afford it, certainly with an ever-increasing estimate. We're up to almost 500 million to purchase and install, 500,000, excuse me, 4,600 per home. That's almost $500,000 to put in to upgrade 8 transformers, labor and transformers. It just doesn't really make sense, and I know we can find the.
Thank you. You're. I don't know if you heard the bell, but
No,
just a reminder, it's a 3-minute. Thank you. I'm sorry, the last name's Chen, and I can't read the first name. Starts with a W? Thanks.
Dear Commissioners, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak here. My name is Weidong Chen. I have the honor of living on a corner house on Glenbrook Drive. And when I moved in 2004, besides those wonderful people, I really like the neighborhood because I don't see those messy power lines anywhere. I really like that. And recently, I just found out that the utility department is planning to put a transformer box right on my property. And it will be right in front of my bedroom window. So talking about safety, when something goes wrong, or transformer blows or causing fire, or even explosion with a pad mount, my bedroom window will be the first to go. My mother-in-law right now lives there. And of course, when my kids come back, I don't know where the location will be exactly, but I have bedrooms, around those sides. So this is safety for me, for my family, and I really feel it's not safe. And, I purchased the property with understanding that the system will stay fully underground. And I really hope that the utility department will work in earnest with us, with the neighborhood, to find a solution that will keep the system fully underground, which is where it is today, and I hope it will stay for the future as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Eugene Lee.
Commissioners, staff, and fellow neighbors. My name is Eugene Lee, and I live on Pomona Avenue in Green Acres. And I appreciate your taking the time today to hear our concerns. It was really interesting when I think I saw an earlier slide today that indicated that when our system was put in 1972, I was 2 years old. By the end of next year, I will be 50. I'm really impressed with how well the system has run. I think that, in the years that I've been here, I've even had people come over, friends that come over and charge their phones using the electricity. They actually asked me, wow, everything charges so quickly. Did you put in some special equipment or something? And I'm embarrassed to tell them that it's 46 years old. But it's functioning great. Earlier today, during the first discussion item, I think there was a very interesting Latin term that was put up there. It says, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. This system here, I know that we've discussed a lot of issues about safety from both sides, from the employee side, for staff, and also for neighbors. But if we look at it, our system has been relatively low maintenance. I think in the past, in some prior discussions with staff at some earlier meetings, there was a discussion, and basically I was told that we have a very low draw, low maintenance system. So everything's been functioning extremely well. And so when we're presented with an opportunity to perhaps put in equipment that's pad mounted, I believe the expected life of a pad mount probably is around 20, 25 years or something, or at least most equipment's slated for a 20, 25-year life. I look upon, what our equipment has performed and recognize that, my goodness, there may be statistics, but the actual fact is, if you look at exact reality, look at our equipment. Our equipment is actually done very well. So it's almost like when we look at all the facts that pertain to our neighborhood, it would seem that, seems like almost like a no-brainer that the best solution is to find one, is a solution that replaces our exact units. So as I look back and look at all the cost estimates, it indicated that the pad mount solution would be $350,000. If we apply maybe a 25 to 30-year life to the equipment, that means every single month, and this is something that utilities is very happy to cover the cost for us. That's about $11 to $12 a month that we've been paying every month towards the replacement of the equipment. I think that as we explore an underground solution, I'd like to apply that $11 to $12 that we've been paying for the last 46 years and see if we can perhaps utilize that as a means to providing us with a safe secure, and underground solution as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Ada Banks.
Hi, my name is Ada Banks. I live on Los Palos Circle in Green Acres, and I feel that all the equipment, with no exception, should be underground. I think times have changed, and our priorities should be very different. We have seen the danger and the devastation of the fires, of loss of life and property, and we should start thinking about the whole issue in a very different light than what we were thinking about it previously. Because underground might save many lives here, and things would be very different. As you said, that you have the obligation to give us reliable and safe service, and I hope we can achieve it much better, I believe, if it was all underground. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael Morier?
Well, greetings from Green Acres 1. We having fun now? Our little landlocked 100-household neighborhood, also known as Fort Apache. We were first informed on March 10th, 2018 by the CPAU about their scheme to rebuild our high-voltage grid. That's 9 months ago. In almost every subsequent communication with the CPAU, we've heard them repeat the phrase, next steps. OEO, next steps, next steps, next steps, OEO. We're not lemmings, okay? Our neighborhood has had a long and contentious history with various developer enthusiasms and civic organizations. We've frequently been threatened by someone else's ill-conceived, unsolicited projects, and we don't respond well to threats or forced marches. Frankly, we find dealing with them tiresome, but we've had to learn how. City planning department, legal department, school district. I got to tell you this, however, this experience with the CPAU is particularly distressing. Bluntly, what are we to make of them? It's been obdurate, flexible, wretched to work with, simply doesn't appear to have a firm grip on the electrical realities in Palo Alto. When I get into one of these situations, though, I start thinking, all right, how do I get out of this sack full of fight? I've got 3 possible solutions for all of us to get out of this. I hope you'll bear with me while I run through them, because if it were me, I'd be looking for the exits. I am now. This is 9 months, and it promises to stretch out further, and we're all getting tired of it. I'm sure you will. 1, 3 doors. We might proceed lemming fashion to the CPU's next step. We can go through the process of perhaps giving the CPU legal leverage and financial mechanisms to extort blank check funds from our residents to keep our minuscule number of electrical high voltage systems underground. That other district, by the way, that we know about, the one we know about on Orm, it's got 1 box. It's the only other one we've ever been told about. This will prove expensive, time and resource consuming, and will simply be unaffordable by most of our residents. It'll produce pad mount installations forced on a teeny neighborhood. It'll result in litigation, can create even more permanently angered and disaffected groups of resident CPU customers, if that's possible. 2, we can work on a strategy plan suited to the unique circumstances of Green Acres 1. We can reboot this sorry lemming parade through Fort Apache, send competent senior electrical engineers to GA1 and in the company of our authorized representatives to open actually access the existing vaults and equipment and explore the feasibility of locations for underground systems. I repeat, for underground systems. The notion of putting them around out of sight was helpful, but it was still pad mount. We can come up with a detailed budget estimate for such replacements and maintenance, research and evaluate existing funding in the CPA's own corresponding reserves, which we've been steadily paying into for how many ever years. Or 3, we could just agree to leave Green Acres 1 alone. Just focus on CPA's efforts on existing stated city priorities to bring the city's remaining manifestly vulnerable and highly unsafe pole-mounted electrical equipment onto or preferably underground. Now, if you followed the fires, the pictures aren't pretty. Pad mounts, pole mounts. No one would be any worse off than we are now if we just simply let the whole thing alone and the CPA comes into Green Acres 1 to just fix whatever fails, as they'd have to now if anything failed. We're hope you're not inclined to follow any lemmings. We sure aren't. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions over here? No more, I have no more cards.
I just have, are we allowed to ask the questions of the commenters? I was just wondering, the survey that was conducted, you mentioned that there were 2 respondents who would possibly consider pad mounted. What was the sample size of the survey? How many people did respond?
In one survey, there were 19.
Can you come to the mic?
In one survey, there were 19, and in one there were 15.
And as long as you're at the podium, did the survey also, was one of the options that the residents would pay the differential cost?
Yes.
Okay.
But the cost that we had was one that, we couldn't substantiate. It was just a number that the Palo Alto Utilities Department gave us. And people had lots of questions about that number.
Well, I'm more ready for conclusions and what we're going to do, so I want to make sure everybody else is comfortable first.
I'm not sure they're questions, they're just comments. Okay, go ahead.
I just wondered that there were several questions raised by some of the speakers that I would like to hear the staff's response to, which goes back to this question of whether there are other districts which are really in the same position as Green Acres, particularly the ones that have already been upgraded, 6 and 7, because there seemed to be a disagreement on that.
I'll jump in, but Greg actually had the conversation. It was a verbal question, I believe, from Ms. Bell.
Yes. Ms. Bell was one of the people that raised it.
So we were, I think previously we've been talking about districts that currently have all subsurface equipment that are, currently we have 5 of them that are in our 5-year replacement or rebuild infrastructure plan. That would be coming up to pad mount to our current standards where it was feasible. I believe the question that Greg had was what he understood was what other of these districts also petitioned for and paid for part of the costs. And there was only one that we came up with. There may have been more, but I mean, this just required going back and looking at records, but we understood that her question had to do with other districts that had paid for part of the undergrounding cost in the first place.
So there have been other upgraded districts that were pad mounted who didn't ask to remain subsurface, and so those weren't part of the numbers. It's only if they were upgraded and asked to keep it underground.
Greg, I don't know if you want to jump in, but my understanding from Greg was the question was, were there other districts that were either originally or are still at the moment fully subsurface, that when that district was formed and the original conversion from pole to above ground to underground occurred, that it was one of those districts that was found to be of primarily local benefit, and therefore the property owners paid, at that time would have been 25% of the cost. That's what you understood?
Correct, yes.
So that one particular question, when we came up with 25, that was the only one after a kind of like a quick look through. So bearing in mind this just would require staff to go back and pull up all the records of the original formations of the districts. but our kind of our general knowledge in the office and pulling on staff that have been there for a while, they just had the recollection of the one. However, there are other residential districts that were originally undergrounded with all subsurface equipment.
So there was also discussion about installing underground boxes on Arrestradero and at the school. Is that correct? Those boxes are, those transformers and switches are being installed underground?
Do you recall which ones those are? I know we have one current rebuild that's a small district. We had an issue of right-of-way, and so one new piece of equipment did go underground, but we have one that's pad-mounted. I don't know if that's the one that we're discussing.
Why do you know that the Arrestadero corridor is another underground district that I'm responsible for rebuilding, and we haven't started rebuilding anything yet because we're still in the process of doing the design work for it. So I know they're going through and I believe resurfacing or doing some infrastructure changes, but electric is not involved in that at this point.
So there's no renewal of the transformers and switches at this point going on there?
I'm not aware of any.
Okay.
So that's the new, so we do have the new District 46, so that's a kind of recent, so, okay, I think that's the one maybe we had, it was a small area and we had two pieces of equipment that were going to be pad mounted. One.
But they weren't in the scope of
But one wasn't feasible.
and the other one wasn't in the scope of the district.
They've connected to something that was already existing.
And the last question where I thought there was some discrepancy was about whether District 6 always had pad mounted, or whether District 6 was a situation where the transformers and switches were underground, but they now have been pad mounted since the renewal.
Going through the records, I noticed that a lot of the new District 6 was rebuilt with pad mount transformers in the late 90s. And looking at the earlier maps, it appeared that they were subsurface beforehand.
Following up on Commissioner Johnston's desire to clarify some things that seem to be discrepancies, is the revised pad-mounted design, there was a property owner who said that there would be a transformer box on that resident's property. My understanding of the process is that the city actually has right-of-way. Can you confirm, would it be on a homeowner's property or would it be on the city's property?
It would be on city right away.
Okay. And another question, there seems to be a sort of, from the residents, a deep level of distrust of the cost estimates for the the subsurface transformer equipment. Can you speak to where those estimates came from? And also, is it feasible to turn over receipts and signed contracts from previous city projects? A, are there sort of reasons that those aren't available, or B, are they applicable to this situation? Is the equipment and labor similar?
Greg, I think you got the estimates for the equipment. When we just, regular suppliers, Greg contacted them and asked for quotes on equipment. So that's where that was from, and I don't see any reason why that couldn't be shared, could it?
Yeah, for the equipment, we did it based on the last purchase price. That's how we log it in the system. And then for the actual substructure work, the conduits, the boxes, I reached out to our contractor who does that work for us and got quotes from them directly, and that's how we priced it.
So those could be substantiated if necessary?
Yes.
One other question. I think you answered it in your opening presentation. Is it an option to do nothing?
it's not in the best interest, because if we have a failure, a cable failure, it might also damage conduit. So a proactive approach of replacing equipment before it failures is cheaper in the long run, because if we have a failure, we might be paying overtime to replace it at night. The outages might be longer because it might damage equipment. That's not only the piece that failed. So for us, we don't want to run the system to failure. We want to replace it before we get to that point.
And just to add on that, I think kind of just linking again back with our talk about resilience and comments we heard about residents who may have medical conditions where they're relying on reliable electricity. I don't know if we know there's anyone in that neighborhood that would be, more affected if they started to get interruptions in their electricity supply. Can it be done? There are certainly utilities that wait until failures start to occur before they prioritize replacement. That's not what we aim to do in Palo Alto.
So I'm going to at least throw out some options here. It seems to me technically we just don't have any information except to recommend the staff proposal from last time with the modification of 6 pads instead of 9. And quite frankly, I think that's grossly irresponsible, because all we'd be doing is passing this problem onto the council rather than doing our jobs. Instead, I'm going to quote Michael Morier a couple of times, because I think a couple of things he said were absolutely right. At least for me, his quote on his December 3rd letter to us, the UAC apparently was hearing a lot of brand new information on the issue, trying hard to come up to speed. I knew nothing about this coming in there, and all I heard was how wretched the process was, not about technical problems. So for whatever reason today, I heard a lot of good technical issues being raised. And, my preference would be to get people together and work out these things. From what I can see, it's a real serious OSHA problem, and that could be an enormous financial liability for the city if problems happen. But there are legitimate questions being raised about why we're doing it elsewhere. So my preferred alternative is to have a community meeting and talk about these issues and invite the groups, not just Green Acres, but the next 5 groups along. My major problem with this whole thing, having done major engineering projects my whole life, not as a designer, but as a policymaker, is we got to get people involved early, and hence my second comment. If I were in Michael Morier's shoes, I would say we're marching you like lemmings. So I would prefer that we work out these technical issues. The additional thing I would make is the second I saw feedback from community representatives, a solution that include pad mounts is not acceptable. We've got to work that out. I at least would like to have some sort of community meeting where we talk about it and have those people that have been complaining about this potential decision in front of us helping set up the agenda for the meeting rather than it unilaterally done by staff. But it seems to me that's our 2 alternatives. We can send this along the council and, to me, ignore our responsibilities to do the digging in for the council. If I were sitting there, I wouldn't feel like we did our job if we dumped it on them in the shape it is now.
Yeah, I'm thinking and talking in real time. I agree that community meetings sound like a great idea. I'm unclear on it. how many have been held and how, I wouldn't want to repeat a process that's been tried a couple of times and has not reached resolution. I remember seeing in some of the written correspondence from the residents that they didn't want to come to a community meeting about pad-mounted designs because that would indicate that they would accept a pad-mounted design, and they didn't want to send a false signal of even wanting to talk about a pad-mounted design. So I wouldn't want to repeat a meeting of that, a meeting that the community couldn't participate in for not wanting to send a signal. I mean, it seems to me like there's a few key issues that this boils down to. You know, will the city of Palo Alto even consider designs that are less safe than, you know, safety is not a binary thing. These pad mounts are safe and subsurface is unsafe. It's a spectrum. And my impression, and I'm not really in a position to question authorities on the subject, is that pad-mounted transformers are generally felt to be more safe than subsurface transformers. So there are cases when the city has to install them subsurface. Does that mean that we will sort of accept similar increased risks when we don't have to? I think that's a policy question worth debating. Assuming that we do, then there's the whole issue of who pays for it, and then if it's not the rate-paying community at large that pays for it, then what's a mechanism by which those who sort of benefit from the subsurface installation, sort of what's the mechanism by which they can make that decision and then pay for it? And it does seem that you know, one of the things I jotted down is sort of like, to answer that question, there's another philosophical or policy question around, you know, back in 1973, when the existing residents paid 25% of the cost to underground their utilities, were they buying that set of equipment with a useful life of 30 to 45 years, or were they buying a right in perpetuity to have all of their utilities undergrounded? And I think that, you know, might be certainly a question we can debate and that council might have to debate, because it is a, I think, key issue on which this question turns is, do the ratepayers of the city of Palo Alto at large have an obligation to continue to support Green Acres 1973 original investment, or is that an investment whose useful life has served? And now, if the Green Acres community wants to continue to have a subsurface equipment, do they have to make an additional renewed investment to keep that benefit? I do think that, well, there have been mentions, in our last meeting, there were mentions of taxpayers. I think today, at least, we've correctly identified ratepayers. But there's been a mention of City of Palo Alto utility surpluses that could be used to pay for this. And I just want to dispel the notion that there are surpluses. There are reserve funds that are sort of, my understanding, and I'm looking at Dave, who explained it to me once, you know, the way the business model of the utility works is that funds are collected in reserve funds in order to then, those funds are earmarked to spend on infrastructure upgrades. So there's not money lying around that could be spent on additional equipment without it impacting all the other people, all the other electric utility customers in Palo Alto. So then back to Terry's question, you know, what is the next step? And sorry to say the word next step again. I think when you reach a new and thorny policy question, slow and careful steps might be better than rushing headlong into something. If we do think that the city is willing to accept take more safety risk than might be necessary. If we cross that hurdle and we enter into the who should pay for it, we can either have another community meeting. I think it's pretty clear what, my sense is that the residents have a pretty, actually, I don't know. What I'm hearing the residents say is they can't weigh in on whether they would be willing to pay for it unless they know a much more precise dollar amount on how much it would be. And I don't know how feasible that is to procure for them. So I guess what I'm saying, I'm not sure another community meeting makes sense, and I think it might be us doing our job to recommend to City Council so the beginnings, the outline, the framework of a policy in the form of a procedure by which a neighborhood can petition to make an exception to Rule 3 if we accept the safety risk. I'll stop talking and let somebody else chime in.
So as I listen to this, I have a couple thoughts. One is, I understand that you haven't been able to find any studies about the safety issue, and that's, to me, the big missing piece, because intuitively, I understand why the utilities would want to have the equipment pad mounted. That makes complete sense to me. I will, in Commissioner Ballantyne's absence, so I'll make his typical point for him, because he and I are both submariners. You want your equipment where you can see it and get at it and fix it. Having it in a hole in the ground is not ideal. But I think there are some safety issues that people have raised that it would be interesting to know more about, and it's hard for me to believe there isn't more information about that. If, in fact, having pad-mounted equipment is the industry standard, there must be a reason for that, is articulable. The second issue that I hear is we have underground equipment, and we're still installing underground equipment. I understand we're only doing it in areas where it's not feasible to have pad-mounted equipment, but that tells me that the safety issues are not so extreme that underground equipment is just can't be done. So that brings to the point that, well, if it's possible to have underground equipment, should it be an option for neighborhoods where it may not be as necessary as it is in certain commercial neighborhoods, but it's still something that the neighborhood wants. And in my view, in that situation, it's perfectly fair to ask the neighborhood to pay the incremental cost. Now, those costs have to be specified. I mean, they got to be pinned down, and it sounds like more could be done here to pin those costs down. But I have personally no problem with the idea that if the neighbors say we want everything underground and we're willing to pay for it, that's something that the city should be willing to consider. Now, to the point that others have already made, you have other neighborhoods that are coming up. They're going to have the same issue. So I think it is important to have a policy that you're going to apply going forward, so that each neighborhood is treated equally and fairly. And now's the time to do that, because the issue's been teed up, and you're going to have that. That doesn't give you a lot of guidance, I don't think, in terms of the next step, other than I do think it makes sense to move forward on a mechanism for having neighborhoods vote on this issue and have if they vote, accept the additional cost, there's a way of collecting that cost. I'm sure it can be done through the utility bills. I don't know the right answer to, what the vote has to be, whether it's 2/3 or 75% as has been suggested, or how the funds would be collected over the utility bills. But I think that there's certainly a mechanism that, in my view, that could be done. But the most important thing is to kind of think about what the policy is going to be going forward when this question comes up again and again and again.
And I would agree with that, since we know this is potentially an ongoing issue, and we will be continuing to upgrade subsurface equipment. However it is upgraded, that this is something we should decide so that there aren't 9 months of community meetings with the next district as well. And I think we're all feeling the same frustration about not having clear safety guidelines. That would, make it certainly a lot easier. If there's anything else that's out there that is helpful in that regard. It sounds like any new subsurface is really as a default when it's the only way to provide electric services. But if that's the case, I'm not even sure that's the case, so that would be helpful to know. And it would also be interesting to know, I don't know if this is too much work, but for those districts that did contribute to the original undergrounding, when that allocation happened, if it was based on the lifespan of the equipment or the cost of the equipment or something that gives us some insight into what the expectations were, that would be helpful to know as well.
So can I suggest that we bifurcate this? I think all 4 of us are in agreement on getting a procedure moving in. I will just add my voice in that the people that benefit need to pay for it, which is what I thought everybody else was saying. So the question I have from there is, the staff need further guidance on the drafting the rules that you're talking about here, as opposed to the Green Acres project.
So going back to our questions, so I think what we're hearing is kind of a feeling that we should move forward and draft some rule and regulation or process for neighborhoods such as this to petition. And that it would be fair that additional costs be paid for by those that are petitioning.
Meaning the district where it's happening?
Yes, correct. So I think that's what I'm hearing there. Are you kind of getting that?
Right,
clear?
and so perhaps as next steps, assuming that again is, and perhaps we could use a vote at some point, that there are specifics to how that mechanism would work, that staff has, I think, taken some shot at proposing. We might be able to come up with a little more specificity as to, how costs would be nailed down, the time frame in which that would happen. Again, the issue of the level of community support necessary to start the process, and then how that would then translate into election requirements and the like. So we could develop that more specifically. And to Commissioner Trumbull's point, that if we take that next step again in trying to define this process more clearly, clearly noticing other neighborhoods that might be subject to this, because similarly situated in terms of having existing transformers that are underground, we could use that straw man, so to speak, or that initial proposal to get some feedback on as well. I think it would be fair to say that if we go through that exercise, that process of really trying to flesh out what that procedure would be, we will set some expectations that Green Acres will be expected to work through that process once it is finalized. And again, so would hope to have their participation as well as the participation from other neighborhoods in the city.
And just going back to our original questions, if there is to be a fee, this incremental cost assessment, what would those components be? And what staff suggested, again, that the initial out-of-pocket expenses for the more expensive equipment, installation, and then some ongoing ownership costs to cover the maintenance and additional losses. And then that third one was if we go through this property owner election, should the cost of that also be put in the fee?
I can give you my reaction to those. Although there's one thing I want to say first. It does seem important that when, at the moment of election, that the people in the owners in an underground district have a firm dollar amount. So it seems like it should perhaps be part of the procedure for the city to use their best estimation methods, but then commit to that figure. And if the actual construction and installation costs are less, that the residents would pay less, but that if it went over, that it would be held firm to the amount that they had voted on. To me, my reaction is that the difference in equipment and installation costs should be included, cost of ownership, but not administering an election. It seems like that's something that the city should cover for any district.
I agree with Commissioner Forcell on those points. I'm not sure I quite understood what the cost of ownership is, the incremental cost of ownership. I mean, if there really is additional labor cost for repairing underground, which I would understand, that certainly makes sense. But other than that, and the additional cost of the facilities, is there a shorter lifespan for underground equipment?
Expected, yes. But obviously, in practice, in this particular neighborhood, not. What the cost of ownership, so again, the standard for the special facilities charge did include a replacement fee, and we were recommending that not be included. The other components were, like I said, there's this, again, if we go back to the memo on page 5 of the report, we have what we're saying, rather than for special facilities, proposed maintenance and operations fee calculation. So that uses a factor, and as I said, we just basically went off our current special facilities fee that uses this factor, like 6.7%, as an annual cost of ownership of facilities. It includes a number of factors, including the fact that returns to the city are based on our asset base, so increased asset base does cost the utility more in returns to the city, and the maintenance of those facilities. Now, it comes down to whether the subsurface equipment is substantially more costly to maintain than a pad mount. I mean, we could be going, taking this further and trying to come up with some more specific estimate on there, but this is an average across the utility.
So
and there's also losses. There's additional losses that are predicted for the or calculated for the underground equipment.
These are losses, electrical losses? Okay. Well, I mean, I understand that there may be additional maintenance fees, and that should be included. If there are additional losses, that should be included. I agree that we should not include the replacement cost, because you're essentially saying we will then continue to have underground facilities. I mean, you're getting people to pay in advance to replace it, and unless you're prepared to commit to that, I don't think you can charge for it.
Well, I think we've given staff good enough direction, and I would ask that they fill in the details on this and bring it back to us for a public hearing to allow the public to comment on it. So if a motion works, I will so move.
I don't think we're supposed to, it's not an action item.
Okay.
Yeah, we inadvertently, I suppose, agendize this as a discussion item rather than action. So, given notice, I think we can take that as feedback to staff and take some next steps. Ultimately, this is coming back to the commission, so I think we do have enough guidance. Okay.
I'm still not clear whether we've resolved the Green Acres situation. Certainly, Commissioner Forcell's suggestion would mean we'd have to wait for the rules and procedures to be completed.
That would
I'm
be
fine
our,
with that.
That would be our next step.
As long as we're clear.
Yes. I think it's fair to say that neighborhood has told us that they're fine with the status quo, and the urgency is really driven by the utilities' responsibility to ensure safe and reliable services. And so I think we'll take that as latitude to proceed as quickly as we can to bring this back to the commission.
So I have one comment, if everybody else is through with those suggestions, which is I still strongly urge you to meet now and a process that may be more than 9 months with any area that's going to get underground and start talking to them about it. I don't feel a need to design. I want the public to feel like they're going to have some input into design, or you're going to end up with a feeling like Lemmings reaction. So, just me.
I would second that we know what's coming up again, so as these policies and procedures are put in place, I think it would be useful to try to include members of those districts. I mean, obviously, anyone should be encouraged to come, but with a special focus on those districts, so that while we're all learning with this situation, hopefully the next time everyone's a little, a lot more informed and able to maneuver quicker. And I would just throw in, I agree that we would not want to include the election costs, the owner election costs as part of the expenses.
All done?
No?
Can I make a comment on the safety thing? Because I think there's the safety thing, and then there's the who pays for it. And I think somebody from the community brought this up, and I think it would be useful to know how many of these things are underground elsewhere in the city, right? And somebody suggested that. I mean, I don't know that that's going to give us a lot of guidance. It might, right? I mean, if the answer is there's 1,000 of these things in the city and this is another 9, then that's going to point us one direction. If the answer is, well, there's 8 of these things elsewhere in the city, well, then we haven't, then it's not, we're not going to be able to draw any conclusions for that, but at least it would be useful to know. Even ballpark.
Anything else? Great. Any topics for discussion for future UAC meetings? No?
The procedure. the procedure that we're talking about.
Oh, yeah, I actually have one before you go, which is at some point it would be nice to get an update on succession planning and what open positions there are.
Oh, yes.
And recruitment and workforce development.
So in fact, I can share with you. Well, as a matter of fact, and this, I'll watch kind of how much detail I give you, but there is an item on the City Council's agenda next week, December 10th, to approve the UMPAPA, Utility Management Professionals Association of Palo Alto. UMPAPA, employee organizations, very first negotiated memorandum of agreement. UMPAPA was originally petitioned back in 2009, did not at that point reach agreement with the city on terms, actually had an imposed agreement in 2013, I believe, or somewhere thereabouts. And again, so roughly 9-10 years after its initial creation, has reached agreement with the city of Palo Alto. So I think that that's a landmark worth celebrating, even though, as is typical of labor agreements, no one feels like celebrating once they're done. But that said, it has established a compensation increase that is largely a catch-up over increases that had not happened over some period of time. Based on that, we do expect succession to occur in the foreseeable future, because there will be some retirements I think we are anticipating to come up within the next year or so. So we are actively working on the follow-up actions that are necessary in order to ensure that we can continue operations with that potential need for transition of staff. So we'll be happy to come back with more specifics as to what's ongoing. We are also in now active negotiations with non-management, the Service Employees International Union, that again is just kicking off, but will be probably a several-month process upcoming. So happy to provide information that we can outside of the labor context, but that action on the UMPAPA agreement is a really significant one, both good news and perhaps not so good news in terms of succession required. But it's a rare opportunity for us to actually see the need coming, at least give or take a year in advance. So we're going to want to move on that as both expeditiously and transparently as we can.
Thank you. So do we have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
A second.
We're adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me also say on behalf of staff, we really appreciate your wrestling with this undergrounding issue. I know it's a difficult one. It's one clearly that has lots of, appreciated your not binary, like gray areas involved, and your guidance is much appreciated.